Welcome back, everybody. We will get your sports news to you in a short while, but we want to take our first interview up front now. Ordinary South Africans, civil society groups and politicians reacted with shock, dismay and anger to the latest Auditor General's report on the performance of municipalities. Results for the 2018-2019 financial year show an increase in irregular expenditure amounting to 32 billion rand, which is 7 billion rand increase compared to the previous year. The Auditor General, Kimi Makwetu, said that only 20 of the 257 municipalities had a clean bill of health financially. To discuss accountability in government, we are now joined by Verashni Pillay, and she's from the Accountability Lab. Verashni, great to see you. Thanks for being with us this morning.
Thanks for having me on the show, Leanne.
You know, I want to say that I'm shocked by the Auditor General's result, but it's a feeling that I have every single time the Auditor General brings out his report, that there is fruitful and wasteful expenditure that could be used to better the lives of South Africans, and yet we're seeing this money just disappearing. 32 billion rand. I mean, you know, why do we keep seeing the same thing over and over again?
Absolutely, and I think many South Africans share your concerns, and there's even been a little bit of fatigue about hearing about this report every year. Now, to be clear, the 32 billion in fruitless and wasteful expenditure is extremely concerning. However, there's much more in the report that is concerning, including things that were spent properly but were not accounted for. And I think that's where the problem is. And I think Mr. Makwetu, our Auditor General, pointed this out, that there isn't an investment from municipalities in actually investing in the financial capacity and resources to actually mainstream financial accountability. And we've seen in the municipalities, I mean, there's only 20 of them, but those that actually did get a clean audit, they don't just make this an annual exercise. They don't just once a year sit down with a bunch of consultants who are very expensive and compile a quick report and send it in. They do a quarterly exercise where they make sure that they're on track. And I think that's what's important when it comes to accountability, to mainstream it. It becomes part of the culture. It shouldn't be, a token exercise.
Yeah, you know, there's a line in the report that the Auditor General, when he was speaking yesterday, came through and said, and I'll quote this, it says, "When looking across the board and after carefully analysing the financial statements we audited, we can safely conclude that local government does have sufficient money and assets to fulfil most of the basic needs and aspirations of its citizens." That must hurt so many South Africans that are sitting in municipalities with not even the basic services being provided to them, whereas, you know, the money that's being given is enough to give the best life to most South Africans, and yet it's not happening. You know, this is something that we need to look into and very, very seriously, is, you know, why many municipalities are getting away with this.
Absolutely, and I think another thing he says in the report is that it's the leadership issue, right? He says, I mean, there's this quote from the presentation that says, in every society, some people do not want to work. Unfortunately, they have the upper hand in a society that lacks good leadership. And that's why we as Accountability Lab are trying to say that leadership has to be everyone's problem. And I think Mr. Makwetu said this as well. He said if all stakeholders cared enough and pushed back hard enough, we will start to see change. And that includes us as voters. We should not get used to hearing this every year, slight degradation until essentially these municipalities are going to go out of business. We're already seeing that with some municipalities. We need to all start pushing back, and we need to all start caring enough to say, who of us are going to step up to become municipal managers one day? I hardly hear anyone ever saying that's a job or a calling that they're looking for, but it's an important calling. For me, it's more important than president.
Oh, yeah.
Because local governments, where tie hits the road when it comes to service delivery.
You're so right.
We can push back against this.
Yeah, you know, that is something that many people don't even take into consideration, is that, you know, you almost aspire to be in these positions to enrich yourself, not to enrich the communities that you live in. And that is very, very flawed in itself. You know, one thing, Verashni, that we need to look at as well is that over the years we've seen many municipalities being put under administration. Does this mean that the process should have been a little bit better, that it should have helped? Have we seen it helping?
The process under administration, you mean? Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
And I think there's only so much that the higher levels can do, provincial and national government, when they come in and put a municipality under administration. It's on the local level that we need to start seeing change. Often top-down change doesn't really help that much. And that's kind of what we've been arguing for. We need to start seeing bottom-up change to hold these people accountable. So when we see those kind of things failing, I think it shows how flawed the triple government system is with local, provincial, and national government. Often there's a miscommunication and things fall apart between the gaps. So I think even with a site like municipal money, that's something the Treasury has put together. If you go to municipal money, you'll see all the municipalities and how they are performing financially, and it's pretty dire reading. The Treasury even says on that website, we're doing this to empower South Africans. And it almost says the subtext that our hands are tied. There's only so much we can do to hold these errant municipalities accountable. You guys have the vote at the end of the day. You guys have the ability to go to those town halls and make your voice heard.
And that's where, your power is held. But the one thing I know that we're always looking at is the findings of the Auditor General and whether or not they are binding. And this was a very big sticking point, is to try and make them a lot more binding. And, the Auditor General always releasing these figures, and they tend to get worse year after year after year. Why is there no oversight that actually stops this irregular expenditure?
Well, I think it's the devolved nature of the system, which is necessary. It can't all be, one track of someone like top-down telling people what to do. But I do know that the Auditor General has been given additional powers to, I think, have some legislative ability to actually enforce their recommendations. However, we haven't seen him really doing that, or the office really doing that, or using those powers. It would be quite dramatic if they did. And Mr. Makwetu, in an interview after the recent results, said, for him, he wants to shift the conversation to not like which municipalities are performing really well, or even, should they be using these larger powers, but how do we actually fundamentally change this thing from the bottom up? How do we actually change and ensure that it becomes a culture of fixing things? And he's pointed out that in the municipalities that have done really well, it's people who have made this an aim, a focus, making sure that their audit outcomes are clean and that they look good. And that's why you see that particular shift. And I tend to agree with him. If he did have the legislative oversight to go and arrest people, we see what happens then. It takes a really long time to get justice. It takes a really long time to affect change in any place in our society when you have to resort to the courts. We have to resort to criminal justice. We need to start creating change in much more intrinsic ways, if I may, in the actual system themselves, by mainstreaming this conversation of we need to do better. And a big thing is that we shouldn't accept this. And I think that's becoming a problem in our society. In the municipalities themselves and us as South Africans, we shouldn't accept this. We should say this is an abnormal situation.
Yeah, it is an abnormal situation. We need to speak out about that. Now, what the Auditor General spoke about in terms of governance and administration lapses is that it is easy for officials to steal from government coffers. Now, my question to you is, what is the gap here? And how can improvements actually be made to change this?
So I think the biggest thing would be capacitating the municipalities with skills, particularly with the chief financial officers and the municipal managers themselves. So right now you saw, I think it was over R1 billion that was spent on, let me get the exact amount, it's so shocking. 1.26 billion rand was spent on consultants in the 2018-2019 financial year, but audit outcomes did not improve. So, you cannot throw money at the problem. You noted this earlier, Anne, that they have the resources to make it work. But what's happening is that at the local level, there isn't a culture of electing the right person and making skills and training the most important part of your hiring. And I know that when I was a journalist, when I was with the Mail and Guardian, I did a project once where I looked at municipalities across the country, and it was actually shocking how few of the municipal managers actually had the relevant qualifications. Something as simple as that. So, you mentioned this earlier. We all think of the big fancy positions, maybe a minister or a parliamentarian, but municipal managers are actually crucial. These people are the ones who the municipality stands and falls on. They're the ones who are going to be hiring the right CFOs, who are going to be managing them, and who are going to be making the priorities in their department, or their municipality rather, to achieve clean outcomes, and more importantly, not to do that as just an exercise, but in order to deliver good services to the community.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to just go back a little bit. We touched on it briefly, but perhaps we can look at it a bit more. The Public Audit Amendment Act and the powers given to the Auditor General. What about that?
Well, this is what I was saying earlier, which was the legislative abilities. We aren't hearing much about that. And when he was asked about this recently, he didn't say much, when I went and read about it. Like I said earlier, and I mean, I know you're asking again, I'm not convinced that additional powers on the Auditor General's part is going to see much of a change. When it comes to something as sprawling and massive as over 200 municipalities and an entrenched culture of disregard in these municipalities, when we've seen improvements, it's been when those people have taken ownership themselves. I know it's tempting as South Africans to say that we want oversight institutions to have a larger bite, but this hasn't really translated into greater law abidement in our officials, if you think about it. I mean, to put it in context, in 2016, not many South Africans know this, but legislation was introduced to introduce an ethics officer in every department of the country at the local, provincial, rather at the provincial and national level. And this is a network of hundreds of ethics officers across the country who are tasked with making sure that ethical procedures are observed. Now, you can put all those legislations in place, but we're not seeing material improvement. And I think more important than that is to see a culture change, a culture shift, which is what we're fighting for as an organization. We're saying if we have positive solutions-based examples of how we can do wonderfully and better as a society, if we name and fame officials who are getting it right, we will start to see a shift.
Yesterday the reactions were something to watch. They really were, and we'll talk to two of them. But one of the reactions was calling on law enforcement agencies to act. Could this have an effect of not only sending guilty municipal members to prison, but actually recouping some of the money? Could this be a way?
I'm sorry, my sound might have dropped a little bit.
I heard that. That. How are you sounding now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay, so what I was saying just quickly in the question, did you hear the question in terms of what calling on law enforcement?
I see a lot of drama, a lot of headlines, and I think you will see perhaps the money getting recouped over time, but I don't think it would make a significant dent. If you look at the state capture years, 10 years, and how much the NPA and other organizations have been able to claw back, it's significant in terms of making us feel better that justice is being served, but it's not particularly significant in making a dent in the problem. And perhaps certain departments and certain officials will be scared in future, but I'm not sure it'll make a big enough impact. I think it's easy for us to call for these big things like let's arrest people, and we surely should do that when there's been criminal activity, but we need more than that to create a holistic solution.
Here was a worrying reaction, and this got, I don't understand this, and perhaps maybe you can help me out here. The Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Minister, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, took a screenshot of the audit report on the department's Twitter account and basically said, Minister Dlamini-Zuma welcomes the Auditor General's municipal audit report. I mean, what is this indicative of? Even her deputy, Park Sao, commented and said there's no excuse for these numbers and acts. I mean, how do you welcome something like that?
I actually missed that tweet, but that is properly shocking. There's no excusing that. It kind of makes me wonder if her account was hacked again. Remember once, the run up to the ANC election, she said her Twitter account was hacked. I don't know what the case is there, but perhaps she was welcoming the release of them, but there's nothing to welcome in the numbers themselves. And I think Mr. Makwetu himself has made that clear, as has her deputy, as you said. And I saw Mr. Tao saying that. And I think that this really speaks to priorities at the cooperative governance level. I mean, she is the minister who should be most concerned about this. So that's very concerning for her to say that.
I mean, it was retweeted 12 hours ago. Verashni, we've got a terrible sound problem with you. I'm going to let you go. I think you've given us enough food for thought. Thank you for being with us. It's an absolute pleasure chatting to you. Verashni Pillay talking to us about accountability or the lack thereof following Auditor General Kimi Makwetu's release of the consolidated local government audit results for the 2018-2019 financial year yesterday. But yes, in terms of that tweet from Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma's account, it's still there. This was 12 hours ago, and it's still saying we welcome the Auditor General's municipal audit report. I'm not sure welcoming the report is the proper reaction that we expect from the minister. I think not welcoming the report might be a better one.